must be rejected. He's talking about from a constitutional framework. Even if there was a quid pro quo, which we have clearly established there was not.
Uh-huh. Right, sure.
And this is what he said, and I'm going to quote it verbatim. The claim that foreign policy decisions can be deemed abuses of power based on subjective opinions about mixed or sole motives that the president was interested only in helping himself demonstrate the dangers of employing the vague, subjective, and politically malleable phrase abuse of power as a constitutionally permissible criteria for the removal of a president. He went on to say, now it follows from this that if a president, any president, were to have done what the Times reported about the content of John Bolton's manuscript, that would not constitute an impeachable offense. I'm quoting exactly from Professor Dershowitz. He says, let me repeat it. Nothing in the Bolton revelations, even if true, would rise to the level of abuse of power or an impeachable offense. That is clear from history. That is clear from the language of the Constitution. You cannot turn conduct that is not impeachable into impeachable conduct simply by using words like quid pro quo and personal benefit. It is inconceivable that the framers would have intended to so politically loaded and promiscuously deployed a term as abuse of power to be weaponized, again, Professor Dershowitz, as a tool of impeachment. It is precisely the kind of vague, open-ended, and subjective term the founders and the framers feared and rejected. Now, to be specific, you cannot impeach a president on an unsourced allegation. But what Professor Dershowitz was saying, even if everything in there was true, it constitutionally doesn't rise to that level. But I want to be clear on this, because there's a lot of speculation out there. With regard to what John Bolton has said, which referenced a number of individuals, we'll start with the president. Here's what the president said in response to that New York Times piece. I never told John Bolton that the aid to Ukraine was tied to investigations into Democrats, including the Bidens. In fact, he never complained about this at the time of his very public termination. If John Bolton said this, it was only to sell a book. The Department of Justice. While the Department of Justice has not reviewed Mr. Bolton's manuscript, the New York Times account of his conversation grossly mischaracterizes what Attorney General Barr and Bolton discussed. There was no discussion of personal favors or undue influence on investigations, nor did the Attorney General state that the president's conversations with foreign leaders were improper. The Vice President's Chief of Staff issued a statement. In every conversation with the President and the Vice President, in preparation for our trip to Poland, remember that was the trip that was being planned for the meeting with President Zelensky, the President consistently expressed his frustration that the United States was bearing the lion's share of responsibility for aid to Ukraine and that European nations weren't doing their part. The president also expressed concerns about corruption in Ukraine, and at no time did I hear him tie Ukraine aid to investigations into the Biden family or Burisma. That was the response. Responding to an unpublished manuscript that maybe some reporters have an idea of maybe what it says. That's what the evidence, if you want to call that evidence, I don't know what you call that. I call it inadmissible, but that's what it is.
We call it gossip.
To argue that the president is not acting in our national interest and is violating his oath of office, which the managers have put forward, is wrong based on the facts and by the way the Constitution is designed. And when you look at the fullness of the record of their witnesses, the witnesses' statements, the transcripts, there's one thing that emerges. There is no violation of law. There's no violation of the Constitution. There is a disagreement on policy decisions. Most of those that spoke at your hearings did not like the president's policy. That's why we have elections. That's what policy differentials and differences are discussed. But to have a removal of a duly elected president based on a policy disagreement, that is not what the framers intended.
I want to weigh in right here. First of all, the majority of the American people, as well as the majority of any other common citizen, regardless of what nation or country they're from, has no earthly ideal of the negotiations that goes on between one leader and another leader in regards to this depth of understanding about these policy-making achievements that he's talking about. The majority of the American people, 99.9% of them, have no earthly ideal towards what the responsibilities of a president, regardless whether it's the president of the United States, the president of the Ukraine, the president of England, the prime minister of wherever, has no earthly ideal of the negotiations and the bickering and the policy making that he's talking about. And to be quite honest with you, 99.9% of them could care less. You know why? Because we pay politicians big money to do these things for us, so that we don't have to wrap our minds around such activities as this. It's beyond our pay grade. It's beyond our comprehension. It's beyond what we understand as normal proceedings versus abnormal proceedings. It's almost like these images of policy making procedures are beyond anything that we could ever even imagine to begin with. So how are we as layman people, common labor layman people, how are we to wrap our minds around something like this if we don't know what the proper proceedings of policy making is to begin with? I couldn't tell you from one episode to another on all these arguments about all these other different things of whether or not one policy procedure is any more righter or wronger than the other. If you was to sit down and examine and give me a test after everything that I have heard, I couldn't a bit more tell you if one of these policy making procedures was a bit more righter than the other one, no more than a man on the moon. And if the truth be known, 98 or 99.9% of not only the American people, but the rest of the world couldn't tell you neither. Because we have not been briefed, we have not been schooled, we have not had to sit in these type of positions of being forced to understand what the difference is or was between proper and improper to begin with. We just know what we have been told. And we have been told that the President of the United States engaged in matters that was inappropriate, and it was based around him trying to profit of the next oncoming election against the Bidens, Mr. Biden, because he felt like that there was some inappropriate behavior that happened with a gas company over in the Ukraine government. That's the only thing that we basically know. Now, whether or not we know that to be proper or improper, whether or not we know that to be factual or fictional, we really are at a maze here of not really understanding what all this is about to begin with. You know why? Because it's beyond our pay grade. That's why we pay you guys the money that we pay you guys. To make sure that you're taking care of us. To make sure that the calls that you're making is in the better interest of we the people. The citizens of not only the United States, but the citizens of our allies pertaining to the Ukrainians or anybody else that will stand up for free, open, fair democracy such as we have here in America. We put our hopes, we put our faith, we put our interest, we put you in the same category as a doctor. If we was laying on a hospital gurney, fixing to be under anesthesia and knocked out, we put our faith solely in you so that you can do the proper thing in our interest, so that whenever we wake up, we can say, thank you, doctor. Thank you for doing the right thing. Thank you for cutting this out or clipping this or mending this or doing this in the better interest of me. Thank you for you doing that. We put our whole faith in you, just like if we was to put our faith in a doctor while being operated on, while being under anesthesia. So whenever all this magnitude of information gets brought out to the American people and the world, we don't a bit more know what is considered proper versus improper than a man on the moon. We just go by what we're told. The thing about what we're being told is so conflicting. It is so abstract of one story versus the other. That's one reason why the majority of us has turned the TV off and said, you know what? Let's go back to our regular, normal procedure ways, the ways that we know, listen to me, the ways that we can identify what's going on in our layman world. Let's go back to doing what we know to be doing, which we believe to be right. The vast majority of us have turned this off because it has been, first of all, too much information for the vast majority of us to consume. And secondly, how do we know what is considered proper or improper? That's the whole reason why that we paid you the money that we paid you, so that you could do the proper thing. We're just going by what we was told. How do we know what's proper or improper? If that would be the case, we would all be candidates of being the President of the United States in not only domestic but foreign affairs. It's been overwhelming for the public to sit and try to guide, direct, try to consume all these pros and cons, do's and don'ts, ups and downs, yeses and nos, proper and improper. It has been absolutely mind-boggling for the majority of the people sitting and listening to these debates, to these court-type-like procedures, and it basically has come to the point of declaring all of this as just some sort of a show. Because in our understanding, once more going back to the layman term, going back to what we consider normal, whenever you have a trial, you have lawyers, you have witnesses, you have a judge, you have various parties that's in place, and if someone says something that's out of line, someone objects to it, overheard or over this, these things is not supposed to be considered versus these things that are. And in our eyes, and I'm speaking for the vast majority of us right here, and if I'm over speaking, please forgive me. But in our eyes, this is beyond us. It's beyond our comprehension that you would declare this as a trial. Because in our eyes, a trial is handled in a different format that has different procedures other than somebody getting up, telling their side of the story towards what they believe is proper or improper to begin with. Once more, how are we to know what's proper or improper? We're putting our lives in your hand. The same way as we would be if we was laying on a gurney fixing to go under, hoping for the best. It's become obnoxious to the vast majority of us that's watched this, that's tried to keep up with this. And I've tried to micromanage this myself. I really have. I've tried to cut through the BS. I've tried to look at this. I've tried to look at that. And I'm thinking to myself, you know what? Whenever you're the President of the United States, you're supposed to be working in the interest of the American people. If you're the President of Europe, I'm pretty sure they think the same thing. You're supposed to be working in the interest of the people over in Europe. If you're the President of Australia, you're supposed to be working in the interest of the Australians. If you're the President of Russia, you're supposed to be working in the interest of the Russians. If you're the President of Canada, you're supposed to be working in the interest of the Canadians. If you're the President of Mexico, you're supposed to be working in the interest of the Mexicans. That's always been my thought. And I'm sure that's probably been the vast majority of everybody else's thought pertaining to the President of whatever country, pertaining to improper or proper behavior. Now all of a sudden we get all this material. We get overwhelmed by all these different testimonies of all these different opinions pertaining to proper and improper and policy making and this and that. And I've said all along, what it boils down to is it's not so much of what the President done in holding back the aid from the Ukrainian people, but it's how he done it. In other words, if he would have went before proper people in the Senate and said, wait a minute here, we need to look at this. We need to pay close attention to this because we know for a fact, or we believe, that this has went on in the past, and because it's went on in the past, let's make sure that it don't go on in the future. If there was that much corruption involving that particular oil company over in Ukraine with the Bidens. But the president didn't do that. Well, once more, why didn't he do that? Because he's the president, right? That would be my assumption, right? He's the president. He didn't have to do that. But according to policy-making rules, he didn't have the authority to do that. Well, if he didn't have the authority to do that, what was he supposed to have done? It's almost as if you're running into a he said, she said conflict pertaining to what is supposed to be right and wrong to begin with as far as policy making. And it becomes so confusing that they themselves don't even know the proper policies. Because nothing ever been written down on paper towards, the way that I understand it, towards what a president either was supposed to do or not supposed to do. In other words, if he done what he done ignorantly, can he be held accountable for his actions? On the other hand, if he done what he done willfully and knowledgeably, and he knowed better not to do what he done, holding up aid to a ally that was involved in war tactics against their enemy pertaining to the Russians. If he done what he done willfully, and he done it intentionally, knowing the rules of the do's and the don'ts as far as policy making, then that's a completely different deal. Then the president stands in violation of these charges that he's being accused of. Once more, you can't just look at the president in a situation like this. You got to look at the cabinet. That's the reason why the president's got attorneys. That's the reason why the president has advisors. That's the reason why the president has representatives. He's got people that are to tell him what he should and should not do in the exchange towards whenever he's doing it. Please, let's try to get this behind us. And let's pray that this will never, ever, ever happen again on the scale that it's happening right now as far as grand confusion on both sides. I personally believe that if he done what he done, willfully, intentionally, knowledgeably, to better his position in attacking his rival, which was Mr. Biden, for the wrong motives, he should be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. If he done what he done ignorantly, and he done what he done because of good conscious faith for the American people, because he felt like that the proceedings that had happened in the past with this oil company and the Ukrainians, that was associated with the Bidens for the benefit of the United States and for the benefit of the people, in fairness, for we the people, then it needs to be looked upon in a different manner. And I think that's the point that we're trying to get to, but my God, it's taken forever and a day to get to it, of understanding rather not what the president done was done in behalf of himself, or rather not he done what he done in the interest of the American people. This is what we're trying to decipher on whether or not it was done ignorantly or intentionally, whether or not it was done for the president or it was done for the benefit of the people by holding up the aid to begin with. I still base it upon the fact that it's not so much what he done, but it's how he done it. And that's the reason why it upset the apple cart. In other words, if he would have taken his intuitions, his concerns, his thoughts about what had occurred in the past with the Bidens and the oil company, this Breesley Oil Company, I guess they're similar to Devon or Chesapeake or some of the other big oil manufacturers in the world. I'm pretty sure they're not as big as Exxon or Gulf or some of these other big ones. But it just needs to be fine-tuned in the magnitude that the American people can understand it. And I truly believe that if he would have went before a certain body of people and got them involved in the decision-making process towards holding up the aid to begin with, we would not be devoting all these hours and days on live TV towards turning this basically into a daggum circus. We wouldn't have to be doing this on our dime. And we could be spending our time in matters that we need to be spending time in, regardless whether it's science research, regardless whether it's space technology, regardless whether it's nanotechnology, regardless whether it's fixing the infrastructure of the roads, regardless whether it's trying to save money in policy makings pertaining to our illegal immigrants, pertaining to the deal with all the people coming over the border illegally. We could be spending our time in areas that would be beneficial to the American tax-paying people and hopefully the benefit of the majority of the world. Instead of spending so much time on policy-making issues towards what is proper versus what is improper. This has just become such of a cancer for people to try to wrap their minds around, because people has lives to live. They're busy. They're going to ball games. Mothers are going to soccer games. They're going to football games. They're trying to teach their children the proper fundamentals of grammar. People is working in factories. Farmers are trying to figure out what's the best corn crop or bean crop to put in next year, or whether or not we need to do further excavation on our property to make sure it don't flood, or if we're using the right type of fertilizer. People are engaged in their own personal lives is what I'm trying to make here. The point that I'm trying to make. Judges are still ruling over criminal acts. Doctors and nurses are still operating on people. Truck drivers are still bringing precious produce either out of this country or into this country. Electric people are still hooking up houses and building commercial buildings. Ship masters are still going and traveling up and down the oceans and bringing in precious cargo or taking out precious cargo. This is upsetting the apple cart in the normalcy of what normal people are subjected to. And because we pay these people to do the right thing, people generally feel abandoned. People feel like that they have been betrayed. Because why should we have to even devote our minds around such activities as this? Why should we even have to be exposed to this? Why? That's why we pay you $250,000 a year or $400,000 a year. We pay you to do these jobs for us. We put you in the position of the benefit of we, the tax-paying people. Why should we have to bring all this out into our eyes and into our minds to sit and debate and ridicule and argue and wonder whether or not this is right or wrong, whether or not this is proper or improper? You know, it was bad enough that the American people had to be subjected to 9/11. Whenever 9/11 occurred, that absolutely just floored a lot of people's thinking and a lot of people's lives to the degree that they had to change course in their lives and start wrapping their minds around the fact that we have got obviously enemies right here in the USA that are out to do us harm in a degree of terrorism. And people had to be subjected to that atmosphere, to that environment. Just like people, by and large, at my age, I'm soon to be 59, have been subjected to all this new technology to the degree that now we have to wrap our minds around telephones and how to operate telephones and basically be telephone programmers. We got to know how to operate this phone and operate that phone. And we got to figure out what this little doodad does. And if you go over here and you hit this, what does that do? And if I get this app, does this app take care of this? Does you know, we basically have to be computer experts just overnight. You know, this was thrown into our laps. I mean, yeah, they told us to get ready for the computer era whenever we was all growing up at my age. But my God, we didn't realize that the whole daggum thing was going to turn into a digital society. Well, now suddenly we've had to wrap our minds around that. You know, Jesus, if you don't have a telephone, a computerized digital smartphone, you're basically left out in the dark. You know, because they're saying now that we're eventually going to be working with a cashless society, and everything's going to be digital to the point that you're not even going to be able to operate towards pumping gas into your automobile without you being some sort of a daggum computer specialist. So now we're all hustling towards trying to feed our minds and get reacquainted and teach ourselves towards how to be computer experts. So it's like, where does this end? How much information is too much information pertaining to the American layman, the common people? Where does this end towards overflowing our minds in the degree that it's now affecting our health? Because the vast majority of people aren't going to be able to handle everything. That's the reason why we pay experts. You no longer have a general practitioner. We have an expert in ears. We have an expert with eyes. We have an expert with the ear, nose, and heart. We have an expert when it comes to people taking out parts and putting in parts. We have an expert whenever it comes to anesthesiology and other parts of the medical. Everybody has their own little compartmentalizing position that they now hold, because you can't consume all of it, every bit of it. So what we have different departments that handle different specialty fields. I've never seen so much information that is overwhelming to the American people, to the point that once they realize that they're trying to take in something that they can't take in, the majority of them do just exactly this. They do just exactly this. They shut it down. They turn it off, because they know that they're not properly coordinated to be able to handle it. And if they can't handle it, they turn it off. They shut it down. There was a lot of people during 9/11. And for the first 90 to 60 days, maybe even 6 months, especially the people up in the New York City area and over towards that field where Virginia and the Pentagon, there was a lot of people that got overwhelmed by all that went on during the time that it went on of 9/11. It just absolutely it blowed their minds. They couldn't conceive it. They couldn't understand it. Why in God's name are we having to deal with this? How come this has been brought into our lives? Now, since it has been brought into our lives, how are we going to handle it? How are we going to conceive it? What are we going to do about it? And now we've had the telephones, and now we're having an open election. Like, not an open election, but an open, if you want to call it a trial, I call it a show. Because a normal trial doesn't proceed itself this way. I just wanted to throw that into my viewers. Get just a little bit of taste of what's happening here, of one side debating another side. I still stand towards a free, fair, open democracy is 1,001 better than communism. We need to remind each other of our limitations in what we're good at and continue to do what we're good at. And we need to be sympathetic towards other people's problems other people's weaknesses and other people's unbearable burdens that has been placed up into their lives, regardless whether it has come in the form of information or it's come in the form of diseases, or it's come in the form of catastrophes that has hit in their area, regardless whether it was floods, famines, pestilences, wars. We need to stay compassionate towards each other, that mankind has its, and whenever I say mankind, I'm talking about humanity, has their limitations towards what we can handle and what we can't handle, and to pray for those who can't handle what has been brought up into their lives. Remain compassionate. Be humble. Be thankful for what you have. And pray for those that are going through such harshness in their lives right now. That's going to be all that I got to say to my viewers. In addition to all of this. Thank you for listening. Thank you. As I travel through this pilgrim land, there is a friend who walks with me. As I kneel in prayer, I hope to meet you there. Precious Jesus, hold my hand. As I kneel in prayer, I hope to meet you there. Precious Jesus, hold my